welcome Norma, Cantu. This is a huge honor. I love you and your work, and you've been so important to me. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Gracias por la invitación. I love chatting with you. We've had some wonderful conversations over the years, and I'm looking forward to it.
So Norma, this is even for me really exciting to learn. I know that you've did from your Vita, there are things that we can gather really easily. You're kind of launching into scholarship with English and poli-sci, your AA and then BS degrees, and then at the University of Nebraska as a PhD, and now you are the Murchison Professor in Humanities at the Trinity University. But maybe you can kind of take us back a little bit into your journey and how you got into living Xicana, Chicanx cultures, rituals, and traditions as a focus of scholarship.
Oh, it's a really interesting path, and I'm not going to have time to give it to you the whole thing, but I am the oldest of 11 children. I was born in Laredo. My mother was from Corpus Christi, Texas. My dad from Mexico. We moved when I was a few months old to Laredo, Texas. My grandmother lived with us, and she's the one I credit with teaching me to read. I was 4 or 5. I learned how to read in Spanish because we didn't speak any English at home. And also to just be curious about the world. She wasn't officially a healer, but she grew all the hierbitas and did the teas and did the egg thing. And so I saw that growing up. I learned it. Lo viví. It's like part of who I am. I lived it. And I think the interest comes in, I was a major of many things along the way. Initially in high school, I had said I wanted to be a physicist. And that didn't come true. I did take science classes, and I was pretty good at it. I was pretty good in math too. But we didn't have such a degree option. And I went to school at night because I worked full time. And during that time at the Laredo Community College, there was only one science teacher, really, a chemistry class that I took. And that was it. So the science went out the door. And I was working in an office, and they would pay my tuition if I took business. So I went, okay, I'll do business. No, that was not for me. And so I switched to education. We could only do business or education as degrees. So I got education with English and political science because I love politics, and my family, we talk politics at the proverbial kitchen table, right? Everybody was involved with it. But the cultural part is the one that I think struck not just here, but here. And it comes from my grandmother, Celia. Just being interested in healing and traditions. And my family is very much about the traditions. And if they don't exist, we invent them. My sisters and I have reunions all the time. Since COVID, we have been meeting weekly on Zoom, doing sisters reunions because we were doing them every 6 months, and we realized that wasn't going to happen. And so the first one came right at we had just gathered in March, and so then we started every week just gathering. So I think that's the interest is there from lived experience. It's embodied knowledge. It's something that Ansaldúa talks about, that we draw from what we know in our own experience. And the books, the publication, the more scholarly aspect of it, I didn't really go into until much later. Although my very first professional presentation at a conference was at the Texas Folklore Society meeting in Kingsville, Texas in 1974, I think it was. It was either fall 73 or spring 74, I'm not very sure. But it was a presenting with one of my professors from Laredo, and I was talking about foodways, basically, tortillas, guisados, different things, and it was a formal, official kind of in the program book presentation. So, but I didn't get into the American Folklore Society the whole thing until I was actually in DC, working at the National Endowment for the Arts in the Folk and Traditional Arts program. And I then attended AFS. This is in the early 90s, and have been involved ever since. I'm the current president. So it just kind of, the path has been circuitous back and forth, but I've always been there. I've always done that work. My own creative writing is what I call creative autobioethnography, because it's so ethnographic. There's so much about tradition and culture. So I don't think you can extricate and say, okay, this is literary criticism, this is cultural work. It's really just one for me.
Mm, beautiful. And so important also that you bring that today, and you have been bringing it in all of your work into the space of folklore studies, which, you know, I know this kind of outside of my area, but from what I know, has really kind of thought of us and our living traditions and rituals as well, things that are stuck in the past.
Such a misconception, because the folklore, as if you want to call it that, is all around us. It's what we live. It is the knowledge of the folk, of the people. And I think that's the other reason I'm so attracted to it, because I've also kind of dabbled in labor studies and some other, I don't know what you would call it, abject subject studies of the people, the masses, and the knowledge and the rich culture that exists. And yeah, even in graduate school, my dissertation is on a folk play, the Pastorela. And again, I had to struggle because it was an English department. And so what am I doing? Writing about a play written in Spanish or presented in Spanish. There wasn't even a written text, really. And so I had to struggle to get that approved. And then on top of that, I wanted to do a semiotic analysis of the play, which had not been done. Most folklore in the early 80s, late 70s, when I was doing the work, was really just descriptive. It wasn't much theoretical analysis. There was some, but that wasn't where folklore was at the time.
So important, and leads me to something that is really like, you know, hot off the press and so exciting. You and Aida putting this together with MeXicana fashions, sartorial styles. Why study this and put this this body of scholarship together?
That's a good question. Both Aida and I love clothes and jewelry and all of the other stuff, and not just buying off the rack, but kind of creating it. I remember a very early Knox conference. I had a T-shirt. I think it was the one in New Mexico in the 80s, and I embroidered it. I got the design and I embroidered and added sequins and stuff. And everybody's going, what? What are you doing? But I've always done that. And I think that also goes back to my family. My mother was a seamstress. And so the interest in fabrics and in adornment, earrings, I mean, to me, earrings are like part of being dressed. If I'm not wearing earrings, I feel funny. And I think the same thing for Aida. Maybe speaking out of turn, she can tell you more about it. But the book actually took a long time because we started talking about it. And then by the time we put out the call for papers and started getting the essays and envisioning what it was to be, I really believe every book has a life. And so this book is one that is, like you said, newborn, but it really took a long time to gestate. And it was in the works for a long time. Partly because we cross borders, we disciplinary borders. Aida is a social scientist. I'm a humanities person. So it was a real interesting negotiation of approaches. And how do you evaluate essays that are coming in from one or the other area? So we in the humanities don't necessarily talk about methodologies or hypotheses or the language of the sciences that social scientists use. So that was kind of an initial negotiation of how are we going to accept these essays, what criteria are we using. My personal interest is the huipil, like the one I'm wearing, And I had wanted to do a whole book on huipiles. There's a real important anthropologist in Mexico, Marta Turok, who's done a lot of work on textiles, not just huipiles, but rebosos también, because they are indigenous and they precede the European contact. I mean, you see pictures or images of La Malinche standing next to Cortés wearing a huipil. And we still actually do have in some, at the Museo de Antropología in Mexico, remnants, pieces of cloth that are over 500 years old. So we know it's been there all this time. And the way that I started studying it, if you will, in quotes, because I study it, but I also practice it, I wear it, is that Chicanas in the 60s and 70s, we were wearing indigenous looking clothes, not necessarily huipiles, but sometimes I would make my own. We kind of crossed that or inherited that legacy and recovered some of that tradition. So it is about identity. It's self-adornment. I mean, the title tells you self-adornment and identity construction. And the politics of it, the undergirding of why a Chicana lawyer would wear a huipil to go into court. Obviously to make a statement, to assert an identity, and then the kind of pushback to that. You're not looking professional. You're wearing big hoops. You shouldn't be doing that. There's a wonderful anecdote about Sonia Sotomayor and how when she was told not to wear the big loops and the red lipstick, and right after she is, I guess, sworn in, she actually goes and changes and puts on her hoops and the red lipstick because that's who she is. And so I think a self-adornment, and it's not just clothes, but it's also jewelry, hair. I would, in fact, my new novel, the subtitle is Hair Matters, because it has to do with the way Chicanas value hair and the identity that's there. And it isn't just about good and bad hair, because that was the obvious one, but it's even deeper, whether transas or indigenous or not. And I mean, I was in graduate school in Nebraska at one time, and one of the professors saw me coming with my trenzas, and she said, "Oh, how ethnic." And I thought, oh, I had never thought of myself as ethnic. I was just being me, right? So that kind of, the politics that undergirds a lot of that is what I'm interested in. And so the studying those styles and studying how, and it is MeXicana because we take the title from Rosalinda Fregoso's book, MeXicana Encounters. And we talk about that in the introduction. I really think merits more. I hope more books come out looking eyebrows. Look at how Chicanas are working with eyebrows, especially now that we're all wearing masks. Even the masks. I have a collection of them. I've been documenting the masks. That's folklore. And it's amazing how identity is there, identity construction, personal style. We all have our style. The fact that you're wearing your cap like that, that's part of your style. So that's why I study it. And I'm just intrigued by it. I'm just very interested in how people present themselves and why. I was thinking about that this morning because of COVID, my hair is now long. I haven't had long hair in a long time, but it's partly because I haven't been to a beauty shop and I haven't dared cut it myself. I cut the ends, but not really short. So even that, I'm thinking, how is COVID affecting hairstyles? What's going to happen? And I know even the celebrities on television, we have seen Stephen Colbert with the long hair, or Seth Meyers has got the long hair. So even there, I mean, I'm always thinking about that, I guess.
Yeah, I love it. I also love that we can go into these spaces, these places that, we have become kind of, habituated to. We just kind of do it and, put our clothes on, but we never really think about until we shine a light on it and look at all the ways that it's so kind of, intricately woven into and also kind of pushing against certain kinds of expectations.
Exactly. We're pushing against the dress for success model that we were in the 80s. That was the big deal. You took these classes of dress for success, and they told you not to wear the big bang, big earrings, and to use certain colors. They gave you a palette that you had to conform to. I never did it. I mean, I read about it, but I never went through it. But I have a lot of friends who did, especially friends in business or in law or particular careers. I mean, we're lucky in academia because we pretty much can get away with stuff. Although I have to tell you that I very consciously, early MLAs, I would wear the MLA suit. Otherwise, they don't listen to you. You don't exist.
Yeah, so amazing. Another really wonderful and exciting, vibrant place that you've been shining a light on is food culture, but within a kind of transborder space. And gosh, you were just sharing with me a little bit of your journey and how this, the family time and the sort of like the discussions you had around the table, and then your first conference. But yeah, can you share a little bit about your work here in this space of food culture?
Yeah, I'm still doing it. Even in these pandemic times when we aren't going out to the restaurants, but there's, and San Antonio is like a living laboratory. There's so much. Also, there's Folklore. Folklore is an email list that the public folklore people have. And there's been an ongoing discussion about the authentic Mexican taco this week, because there was an article in the New York Times last week about how if it is not corn tortillas, it's not a real authentic taco. And of course, all of northern Mexico and South Texas are going, what? No, that's not true. So yeah, food has also been one of the areas that I've been interested in. You have the cover here and a couple of images from Moctezuma's table, a wonderful artist here in San Antonio, Rolando Briseño. I had the honor of editing this anthology of essays on his one exhibit called Moctezuma's Table. He's got a lot of other work that's also very culturally rich. But one of the reasons that I agreed to this is that actually I approached him and I said I would love to do a book on this. It's precisely that. The book and his research goes back to pre-Columbian food traditions, and of course brings him all the way up to now. And he visually presents that in his artwork. And you should see the tables he sets when he has a meal. I don't know if you've read the essay by Sandra Cisneros on, it's a meal at Rolando's, where Rolando and Franco Mondini, another artist, have an argument about the origins of mole and the whole thing with mole, about their mothers making mole. I was there at that meal. And it's one of those kind of highlights where things are happening, people are talking, and everyone's enjoying, and then all of a sudden there's discussion about mole and what is the real recipe and who can make it best. The same with even enchiladas, especially if you go to New Mexico. And the first time I went over there, I was like, I don't want an egg on my enchiladas. That's not how we do it in Texas. Tamales, everybody always talks about the size of the tamales. In Laredo, where I'm from, South Texas, they're tiny. They're the size of my finger. And that tiny tamal is, for me, the most delicious. Other people say, oh no, it's so small. We need the big fat ones, right? Like in Arizona. Or sweet corn tamales, which we didn't grow up with. So you can go in so many directions and with so many theoretical conclusions coming from the way people nourish their bodies, how they fix the food, how they share the food in compañía, because it's very different when you live alone and you eat just alone. I mean, I've been there. Or when you have a family and you have everybody, or even roommates and everybody takes turn cooking. I've been in all those situations. To me, that social aspect of it, it's about culture, yes, but it's also about just being human. and having relationships over food. So one of the saddest parts of the pandemic for me has been the inability to have people over for dinner, fix a nice meal. I've been doing a lot of cooking, but not the same way. I don't know if you know this, but down the hall, I moved a year ago, and down the hall is Arturo Madrid and Antonia Castañeda. And next to them is Tomás Ibarra Fraustro and Dudley. I know, it's like these Chicano icons, right? And so we share, and I just baked an apple bread this week, and I shared it with them. And it's just wonderful to have them down the hall. And this morning we got a loaf of a baguette that Arturo brought over because they went to a bakery this morning. So it's just nice to have that. But we can't just sit around the table and eat because we're not supposed to, right? And even though they're kind of in our social bubble, we're very respectful of the space because it's dangerous, and I don't want to be the cause of anything happening. So I'm very, very careful.
Yeah.
I can't wait for us to be over with this thing so we can go back to doing things like that.
Yeah, but going back to not hesitating and stopping from doing the things that we love, and the hugs and the meals and all of that stuff that's so important. And it's funny that the meal time is a pause. It's a pause that we where we slow down and we let ourselves kind of be human and not be kind of working and kind of in the grind. And I miss that. Yeah, I really miss that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it is sociocultural, definitely.
As we kind of move through our slides here, and I also know that it's very important for you, for me, and for others to really kind of erase this odd kind of line in the sand that's been drawn between scholarship, cultural production, the creative arts, and for us, especially within this space of the transformative borderlands. But maybe you can talk a little bit about that part of your work.
Yeah, that's when I saw this slide, I thought, oh, yeah, it's true. It is creative and transformative, and it is a borderlands. First, the geopolitical real border where I live, and especially where I grew up in Laredo, where it is palpable in everything you do. It's there. But also metaphorically, all the other kinds of borders, the ones that Zaldúa talks about, gender, class, I mean, all the different places where two conflicting notions come together, and either there's a confluence or there's a conflict, and often both in various degrees. And the individual finding herself in that position must negotiate them, but also must, I feel, learn from that. And so what are the lessons? And to me, that's where the creative part comes. The fiction that I write set in that borderlands, working through that borderlands, always for me is about answering questions and learning lessons, one sort or another, about love, about life, religion, all of those things. The other really interesting work, this is one, right? The other one is the anthologies. I have worked a lot on anthologies, con conciencia, and it really starts when I read This Bridge Called My Back and saw the potential. And Zaldúa and I, Gloria and I, had conversations about the importance. Later I did with Cherie as well, because an anthology is a project unlike a single authored book, as you know, where you bring different voices together. And both in conferences and in anthologies, I see my role as a facilitator, as bringing these voices together to create something new, comprehensive, intellectually stimulating, I hope useful to the reader on some level or other. And it's been, what now, 30 years of doing this. So There's been a lot of different anthologies. I did one with scientists, uh, the Pathways to Discovery. That was a really interesting project because scientists don't write. And they kept telling me, I don't write. And I wanted their testimonials. So I did it. I got them together and walked them through some things. And they're beautiful writers, but they didn't know that. And then you have the image from Telling to Live. That was a wonderful experience with 18 Latinas from different disciplines, different Latinidades coming together in physical space in Colorado and working through a lot of the intersectional tensions that exist. Just because we're all Latinas doesn't mean we all see the world the same way. Or that because we're all from different disciplines, we're not going to study the world the same way. So it was just marvelous. I learned a lot from that. And working with Inez, Entre Guadalupe y Malinche, that book took us a long, long time. Talk about long gestation, but it was so worth it. And we gathered over 40 writers and 12 artists, Tejanas, all contemporary. We didn't go back in history. Initially, we had wanted to do an anthology that would go back to 1848 and gather writers and artists all the way. But then we limited it because it was impossible. And so someone else may be able to do that book because we need it. There were Tejanas writing in Texas in the 1880s and 90s and all the way to now, of course. So those are the two ways that I see it being transformative and creative and kind of stepping out or bridging those borders that exist. Borders between disciplines, between Latinidades, between positions. I mean, I just did a Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz symposium with the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center here in San Antonio. And we had Mónica Lavín, who is a novelist from Mexico who writes about Sor Juana, and Alicia Gaspar de Alba, who's a novelist, Xicana novelist, who writes about Sor Juana, and Teresa Yugar, who's a scholar who also writes about Sor Juana, in conversation. And it was so beautiful. So we bridge those things. We do transborder intellectual work that I think is really valuable.
Oh gosh, inspiring. You're an inspiration. I also, your creative work, and I know you talked a little bit about that already, but gosh, as creation, discovery, meaning making, and so much more, but maybe you can share a little bit about this part as well. It's so incredible.
Well, I've been writing since I was 9 years old, so it's nothing new. But I never saw myself as a writer. I always thought of myself as a teacher or a professor who writes. But in 95, when Canicula gets published, and it was not my intent to even write that book. I've been writing it, but I didn't know it. It's really interesting. I was telling you every book has a story. This one is one of those. I was in New Mexico. Ana Castillo was living in Old Town Albuquerque at the time. She was going to be gone that summer. It was the first summer of all my academic career up to then that I was not going to teach both sessions. Because when I was teaching in Laredo, I taught 4 classes a semester, different classes, and summer. It was kind of what we did. And that summer I said, no, I'm not going to teach one session. I'm going to go write. I was going to write a book on the matachines, which I'm still working on, by the way. And instead, out came Canicula. I mean, it just literally would not let me be. And so it was born in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, and UNM published it. And then it was a switch. All of a sudden, I'm no longer a teacher who writes, but I'm a writer who teaches. And it was one of those epiphanies. They don't come very often in one's life, at least not for me. But it was a kind of a, whoa, what am I doing? And then I realized I had always been a writer. I just didn't know it. I didn't give myself permission to own that, to be that. And so Cabañuelas, I finished it in 98 or close to 2000, because then I went back and I reset it, and now it's set in 2000 and 1980. And so it goes back and forth. The original, that's another really interesting story, because the original manuscript had two books in one. And it was rejected when I first submitted it. And the reader had said, these are two books, break them apart. And I resisted it. I said, no, this is how I wrote it. It's a very intricate structure. I want to keep it. And then I went back to it in 2016, and I said, you know what? They're right. It really is two books. So I pulled out all of the Spain material, because the idea, the original was, it was the year 2000 in Laredo, Texas, and 1980 in Madrid. And they were, Nena is going back and forth in the structure that I had devised around the cabañuelas. The cabañuelas is a way of foretelling the future. So it was all structured around that. And so when I published it, all the Spanish part of it, and called it a creative autobiography again, that left all the material from Laredo in 2000 that I don't know what to do with. It's still there. I'm thinking it'll probably become more like a memoir, because a lot of it is autobiographical. I don't know. I'll see. And then you have the Meditación Fronteriza, which is the poetry. These poems go back about, some of them 40 years, when I was in graduate school and writing poems of love, life, and labor. And of course, I didn't put in all the poems I've written since then, but I selected the ones that I felt fit into this thematic of the border, and also the like meaning making. I like that you have that there, because as I was writing those poems, at whatever stage of my life I was in, it was making meaning of my experience. It was giving it sense, making sense of what was happening. And I don't know what else to tell you about that. Poetry is, for me, a mystery. The words come, I write them down, I revise sometimes. Other times it's like, that's it. I can't do anything more to it. The way it comes is the way it stays. But often I'll go back and revise. There's some very long poems in there, and there's some very short ones. There's another book, I don't think you have it in there, that's a collaboration with an artist, Marta Sanchez. It's called Transcendental Train Yards. Some of the poems in Meditación are in that. And what we did, Marta and I collaborated on a book, also a really interesting project, where it's her artwork and my poetry. If you don't have a copy, I'll send you one. It's just fascinating. But I don't know what else to tell you. I look back and I'm amazed. I didn't know I had so many. I mean, when I see them there, I go, oh yeah. And then you have Gabriela's edited collection. Yeah.
Right. I just love that there was a moment for you when you kind of flipped that sort of identity and really saw yourself as a writer who teaches. It's so powerful for me. Gloria Anzaldúa, of course, really important, and we've already talked a little bit, or you've shared a little bit about Anzaldúa's work and your practices and your life. But maybe, gosh, and then this beautiful pedagogy and practice volume that you put together, teaching Gloria Anzaldúa. But is there something, you've talked about Bridge Called My Back, but where it just like this just opened for you?
Oh, absolutely. Borderlands. I didn't read it right after it came out in 87. It must have been 88, maybe 89. And it was another one of those epiphanies. Oh, I can write bilingually. I can put English and Spanish. I've looked at some of the poems and stuff before that, and they're all in English or all in Spanish. So just that, the modeling that she did for us by code switching, by being true to our own language. I mean, it just was like that. It was a sea change. Just poof. The other part Gloria was very spiritual, and I had never allowed myself. I am too. I mean, I've had incredibly powerful religious experiences. I don't, maybe not religious, spiritual experiences, but I never talked about them. I never shared them outside of very intimate situations. She did. And it was just kind of like, whoa, she's talking about la facultad. I know that. I experience it. I have that. And I mean, I had read the Don Juan stories and all of the other, but it was still not mine somehow. But when she writes it, it's mine and I know it. And I can then not just read about it, but also write about it. And it really did change things. I don't think my work, especially more recently, the last 4 or 5 years since Missouri, you know, I translated Borderlands to Spanish when I was living in Missouri. And translating that book was the hardest thing I have ever done, also the most rewarding. I mean, when you go word for word over a text to find the equivalent in the Spanish and stay true to that original intent, translation is one of those things for me. I love doing it because it's almost like doing crossword puzzles. It's like a puzzle, and I love that. But it's also translating a text like a Borderlands. It's also emotional and spiritual. And I mean, she was in my head the whole time. So it was an incredible experience. I don't know if I want to do anything like that again, but it really changed the way I saw Borderlands. So when we started the conference back in 2007, El Mundo Zurdo, it was one kind of process. One time, it was, I think, a place and a space for bringing people who wanted to talk Ansaldúa, what I call Ansalduistas, to kind of wrangle and confront and deal and have difficult conversations about all of the corpus of the work, but also our own. What are we doing? How are we taking this legacy and making it ours? Where are we going from here? So this book particularly focuses on because the conference has various tracks: sexuality and gender, borderlands, education, philosophy. I mean, they're different art and artists. And so this one specifically focused on the pedagogy, the sessions that had to do with that. Not all of the papers in the book are from the conference. Some came through our call for papers, but a lot of them were first tested out, if you will, by scholars at the conference. And so then they got feedback, and it was a long process. Yet this book just flew. I mean, it just took off. Margaret Cantu Sanchez, one of my former students, had the idea to do this. Candace, another former student, joined her. And I said, yes, I'll work with you on this. And it just took off. It was the smoothest, easiest book ever. The papers came in, we went through all of them. There were very few we rejected because they really didn't fit or didn't do what we wanted for the book. But everything that's in there, I think, speaks to a particular aspect of how we use Ansalduan thought in our classrooms and in our communities. And we really wanted to put that in because it's not just about teachers and professors kind of assigning it, but living it and working with the concepts, especially the concept of borderlands. Yeah.
Wow,
Thank you for
beautiful.
including it. Yeah, that one is really hot off the press.
Yeah, and I have my students, my graduate students who are, working in the hubs, my laser hubs, they all have a copy. And this is, in fact, this is the backbone to our year's curriculum with our Latinx high school students for 2020, 2021. So embodied knowledge in practice. Oh my goodness. And now with my high school students, it's amazing what you all have gifted us. Gosh, speaking of classrooms, is there like a trademark approach or method, if you, I don't know if there's some, those sounds so kind of scientific, but for creating knowledge in your classroom spaces?
Oh, wow. Yeah. When I was starting out, I even remember, I think it was in graduate school, I had to write my teaching philosophy, a statement, right? It hasn't changed much. It's changed a little, but not much. The student is first. I mean, why else are we there? And it isn't, it is very Freudian about the concept of the banking concept of education. I'm totally against that. It is a joint adventure, and it really is an adventure. I never know what's going to happen in a class. I don't teach the same class twice, although the same number may appear on the class schedule. It's never the same class. And it's not just changing books that we're reading. So if it's a Chicanx novel, normally I have 2 or 3 texts that are there all the time, but not all the time. And I change them around and I add things, and now I'm doing graphic novels, things that I didn't do 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. So that ability to be flexible, might be a method, if you will, and be able to adapt. The other thing what I try to do is not be like the worst teachers I had. And I had teachers, I'm sure you did too, who had their yellow note cards they read from in class, and they used that every year for the same class over and over. I swore I was never going to do that. I don't. The second kind of trademark would be a lot of allowing students to grow, whatever that means. And in my teaching statement 40 years ago, it was something about being student-centered and all that. Now I don't use that language anymore because I don't think it reflects the actual practice. It really is respect. It's about working with students as adults. I mean, we are in higher education. I suppose it would be very different if I were teaching high school or junior high, but I did my student teaching in middle school, and that's why I'm not there. I keep saying that had I stayed there, it would have been a different life, totally. And so I'm very glad I chose not to do that. So when you're working with adults, whether they're older or younger, we're still on a path. And so I try to be non-judgmental. The non-judgmental, inclusive, respect for each other, respect for the process and the adventure that we're on as in a class. My Camino de Santiago class, every week we have adventures because we're walking the Camino, right? And we learn about the legends, and we learn the history of Spain, and we learn what's going on there. And then I try to connect it with Texas and what we're doing here. So if they're celebrating Corpus Christi and Toledo, how is Corpus Christi celebrated in San Antonio? What are we doing here at the church on Corpus Christi? And there are similarities. It's a religious holiday. So I think that's another kind of method. It's to connect dots.
I love it. The listening, the grace, the connecting of the dots, all of those things that you do, that's so powerful and so wonderful. Thank you, Norma, for that. I know there's so much that is, going on, you're working on, you're constantly opening new doors, but where is the vitality in our Latinx, in our living Latinx cultures and its study today?
Where it's always been. It's in the language, the way that language is changing. It's always changing. And I really see that with the young people, the way that we're using language. And it's also in our self-expressions, the creative aspects. I mean, some of these younger poets that I'm reading are just amazing and pushing against all of the, quote, the canon in really interesting way. is it Matt Cedillo who has the one about mowing the leaves of grass as a title of the poetry collection? I mean, it's really doing some of this work of kind of, yeah, we know Whitman, but this is what we're doing kind of thing. And I also see a lot of vitality in the way, the delivery, the medium, if you will. So yeah, graphic art, blogs, podcasts, all of these technological possibilities that were not there for the Chicano movement are there now. And I see Chicanx scholars, artists using that, pushing that, and I love it. I think that's where the vitality is. We cannot stay with the same old, same old. It's not going to be productive, and it's actually counterproductive. It stifles growth, and it curtails creativity. So we absolutely need to kind of break it apart, break it open. I'm 73. I won't get to see some of the things that are going to happen in the next 50 years, say. But I know I have complete trust that it's going to be exciting and it's going to have a vitality all its own. And it's going to draw from the hybridity of our existence in terms of disciplines, in terms of indigenous traditions. I mean, the fact that we are, quote, recovering some indigeneity, that's not new. But the fact that we're now pushing that forward, I think that's in new ways, that is new. You know, Alurista was playing with language with indigenous Nahuatl words, and Saldúa did that in the 80s, he did in the 70s. So it's a constant evolution, if you will, of working with that. And the other, I'm going to put on my prophet's hat, the other one is science. I really think we're going to push and discover for ourselves that the scientific, especially around climate change, is really there and has always been there. You know, this whole idea of animal studies, you read any Chicanx author for the last 50 years, they've always been doing that. There's always the concern for other sentient beings. We may not have named it that, we may not have called it such, but it was there. And I really think that is going to come to the surface. It's going to emerge as one of these, quote, discoveries. It's been there all along. So yeah, I love the way that you've structured the conversation, because it leads us to the future. And I'm always hopeful. I'm an eternal optimist, even in the midst of what we find ourselves in right now. I know we can do it.
Gosh, Norma, thank you so much for gifting me and us, the listeners and viewers, your journey, part of your journey, your grace, the way you bring us together, create community, open pathways. Oh my goodness, Norma, you are just amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Muchas gracias, de corazón.